Sony just released their latest update to their vlog camera lineup with the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II. It's a great update and all, but are the features really that good? And should you upgrade from the Mark I? Or should you wait and save for something better like the Sony A6700 or the Sony FX30? Let's talk about it more so we can put your time and money in the right place. Otherwise, we'll be buying and returning for days. And nobody's got time for that. The Sony ZV-E10 Mark I is probably one of the most popular cameras that Sony has recently sold. But I decided against buying one myself because I decided that Sony A6400 was just as good, even though it was released before the Sony ZV-E10. The Sony A6400 just so happens to have a flip-up screen that wasn't pulled out to the side, but instead was repositioned over the top. And it doesn't have quick switching modes and still has the traditional photography dial that everybody's so used to. But I've since sold that camera with other gear in order to currently own the Sony FX30 and the Sony A7 IV. As great as these cameras already are, there are shortcomings at the Sony A7 IV when it comes to my video workflow. And I'm actually considering the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II and how it can go ahead and make up for those shortcomings. And do it at a budget without having to buy a new Sony A6700 or an FX30. But I must still help you out and help you consider either of those two cameras if it's a better fit for you. As a full-time nurse with limited time after work to make these videos, I find that the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II as another tool to be able to make my YouTube content creation workflow even smoother. So I've decided to pre-order the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II mostly because of these three main features. The first one being the LUT workflow that I can use for these YouTube videos. In my A7 IV, there is no LUT workflow. And if you don't know what LUTs are, they're pretty much like filters, or at least like the color grade that you add in post to your footage when you shoot in log, or in this case S-Log3. But I want to bypass that whole workflow and just burn those LUTs straight into the footage. With the A7 IV, I can't use LUTs to preview what the final image would look like without using an external monitor, and I can't even burn them in at all. So as a compromise to be able to preview what the footage will look like, I have to go ahead and use the gamma display option. And with the gamma display option, it helps preview what the image would look like without any LUT applied, and just use the general S-Log3 or Rec 709 LUT. Don't worry about too much of that jargon if you don't quite understand that. Just know that the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II can do both in terms of shooting in S-Log3 and also providing a LUT workflow. I can use LUTs as a preview, or I can choose to burn it in and skip the color grade process in post. Since I already know what I want my videos to look like as I film in a controlled setting such as this, then I can comfortably use a LUT for nearly all my shots. But what's even better than just software features like using LUTs in camera is its hardware. I feel even more confident choosing the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II because, like my Sony FX30, this also shares the same sensor, which allows me to not only use the same LUTs, but also use the same exact exposure settings and the same codecs that I can use for multi-cam edits, or not even just for single B-roll shots. So the workflow is smooth and nearly seamless using these two cameras back and forth. Plus, the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II unofficially has a dual-based ISO like the FX30. Sony won't say it, but other creators are saying that the footage looks practically identical when shooting ISO 800 and ISO 2500, which are the two base ISOs coming out of the Sony FX30. At this point, the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II sounds a lot more like an FX30 Mini, and the FX30 is already one of my favorite cameras of 2023. But of all the things that I appreciate about this new Sony camera, it's gotta be that battery life. The Sony ZV-E10 Mark II is now another camera that uses the Sony Z battery, which means a longer battery life for both photo and video. And if you plan on shooting more 4K 24 or 4K 2030, and even now 4K 60 frames per second, you'll need all the battery you can get. Ever since I sold my Sony A6400, I haven't gone back to those smaller Sony batteries. No thank you. All my Sony cameras at this point use the same battery, and I'm not going back. If I need more battery, then I can use a dummy battery plugged into a V-mount battery. The Sony ZV-E10 Mark II with the 16 to 50mm kit lens retails for $1099 US or $998 US for just the body. With these features alone, this makes the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II becoming much more of an excellent video camera for someone who uses this as their only camera, or even as a strong second one at less than $1,400. As much as I enjoyed my Sony A6400, how I use and operate that camera is not that much similar to my FX30 and A7 IV. So there are a few workarounds to match all the camera footage and operate it for video. And the A6400 is already a more than competent video camera for anything. I haven't used the Sony ZV-E10 Mark I, but I would think that the experience is quite similar to the A6400. So that camera is really not going to be for me either. For absolute beginners on a smaller budget, I could still recommend the Sony A6400 or the ZV-E10 Mark I, but if you already own one of these, should you upgrade to the Mark II? Well, let's consider our priorities and let's see if we're also better off with the Sony A6700 or the FX30. If you have another $400 more and your $1,000 budget, the Sony A6700 becomes a possible recommendation. It's a great video camera as well, but is a stronger photo camera to the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II. It provides a viewfinder, mechanical shutter, in-body image stabilization or IBIS, and it gives you features like bulb mode for long exposures if you're into that kind of stuff. The mechanical shutter seems underrated until you're in a low light situation and you start getting what they call banding in your photos. Depending on your lighting situation, your photos can easily end up with the lines or bands across your image, depending on how you orient your camera. And this shutter speed is pretty good, but there's still a chance of getting less sharper images just because the shutter speed may not be quick enough. And if you're shooting with the Sony ZV-E10 without IBIS or image stabilization, you're gonna get those less sharp images because that sensor ain't gonna work for you in terms of keeping your sensor stable. But if you have a mechanical shutter, you can shoot with higher shutter speeds without that banding. So if photo is more of a priority to you and you want to shoot in any condition and any scenario, choose the A6700 instead. I chose not to keep mine because I prefer to have an FX30 for the video and have the dedicated ergonomics. And I decided to ditch it for photography because I need that dual SD card slot for client work and to be able to back up my photos in camera. But if you're not really focused on photography and don't need things like a mechanical shutter, then the FX30 for $1,800 US may be a better fit for you. Like the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II, it's a great video first camera. It's actually part of Sony's cinema line that gives you much more video centric ergonomics and features. You get tally lights to know if you're recording or not. You could also use Sony's XLR top handle if you chose to bundle that up for I think $300 more. You also get the in-body image stabilization, and then coming soon to their future update, you're gonna get things like the shutter angle also programmed in there. And then of course you get all the S-Log, LUT workflow that becomes the reason why I also love this FX30. But if you think the price is a little too steep, don't worry because sometimes you can get it on sale for $1,500 US. I've seen it 3 different times throughout the year already, and actually right now you can also avail that camera at that price. If you're lucky, B&H even sells it used for around $1,400 every now and then. So if any of these features are more important to you and you really are serious with video shooting and even having dual SD card slots, maybe the FX30 is a better choice for you. Plus, you're most likely going to be a more experienced shooter, or at least future-proof yourself for the next couple years. If you're looking to get into content creation and want to invest in your first camera for video, the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II is a great choice for experienced beginners and prosumers. But if you need more info on the Sony A6700 against the Sony FX30, I did make a more detailed comparison over here. But until next time, keep shooting for the life that matters. See ya!